welcome to Chapter 18 of Traditions and Encounters, Nomadic Empires and Eurasian Integration. So this chapter really talks about the Turkish migrants and primarily the Mongols. So first things first are the Turkish migrants. So Turkish peoples were nomadic herders and they were organized into these family village systems called clans. And they lived in the Central Asia steppes. So these were like big grasslands and they were good for grazing, but they had little rain and few rivers. So these nomads and their animals, they were really just drove migratory cycles. So they might be here in 1 year, there in another year, or they would rotate through the seasons. And they live mostly on animal products, so like the animal furs, the milks, basically the meat even. That's really just how their diet was. And they also produce limited amounts of millet, pottery, leather goods, iron. These things primarily because, of course, they were moving all the time, so they couldn't be settled. So the biggest thing was that these people really sought trade, and they were prominent on the caravan routes. So on these trade routes, such as the Silk Roads, you could see them often. And there are two social classes, mainly basically the nobles and commoners. So it's a really basically simple hierarchy, just two classes. And they were also organized into autonomous clans and tribes, so they were all independent of each other. Religions, there were really a lot, so Buddhism, shamanism, also Nestorian Christianity. By this time, different tribes had different religions, and by the 10th century, also as we saw, the growth of Islam. So military organization. They were basically organized with a Khan, which was the ruler, and then they had a confederation or a loose alliance of various tribes. And they also had outstanding cavalry forces, so they were really good horsemen. Also, the Turkish empires in Persia, Anatolia, and India, there were these groups of Turks called the Seljuk Turks, and these people are really important because they really came to occupy many of the big empires we saw before. So they were the successors, and one such was the Abbasid Empire, so they lived on the border of the Abbasid realm, and eventually they overshadowed the caliphs and took over. Also, they occupied the Byzantine Empire, so they migrated in large numbers to Anatolia, which is Turkey again, and they beat the Byzantine army at Manzikert, so this is a good piece of context if you ever want to know, in 1071, and they basically took over. And these people, they also turned Anatolia into an Islamic society because they followed Islam. Also a big thing, there were also Turks that tried to dominate northern India, which at the time was ruled through the Sultanate of Delhi. And so those were the Turkish peoples. Now then there were the Mongols. And the Mongols were basically a big series of empires. So it was founded by this person named Genghis Khan, or sometimes known as Genghis. I'll try to write it over here. And basically what these people did was they did something no one in history had ever done before. And Genghis Khan referred to himself as the universal ruler because he unified all the Mongol tribes that were previously just a loose alliance, like the Turkish migrants, into the Mongol Empire. And they organized these new military units and broke up the different tribes to sort of unify themselves and be stronger together. Also, they chose high officials based on talent and loyalty, so it wasn't just only based on if you were born into it anymore. The strategy was simple, basically horsemanship. Of course, being on the plains, of course you had to learn to ride a horse, and they were really good at it. In fact, like many of their children, when they were like 3, they would start riding horses because eventually they would have to be good archers and have good mobility. And they also relied on psychological warfare, sort of to play with your brain a little bit. So the big thing they did was they conquered the Jurchen in North China, and we'll see this later as they move into more of China. They also conquered Persia at the beginning, Genghis Khan, and he tried to open trade again, but it didn't always happen. So, of course, they took over Persia and destroyed like the Khanate systems, which were like the irrigation systems at the time. Also, Genghis died in 1227, but the big deal was he laid this foundation for a mighty empire that many people associate with the Mongols later on. So after he died, the big Mongol Empire divided into 4 regional empires. So Kublai Khan was one of them. He was one of the grandsons of Khan. And he basically consolidated Mongol rule in China. So this is really important. And he was fairly tolerant because he promoted Buddhism, Taoists, Muslims, Christians. So the big thing about the Mongols that is important to know is that out of history, they're probably one of the most tolerant groups. They really just allowed anyone to practice their religions. Also, he conquered, so they started from the north, and then eventually they came to the south, and they founded the Yuan dynasty. So there's another Chinese dynasty. We'll record that down later. But that's just an important thing to know. So they took over the Song, as we saw last time, and they established their own Chinese, well, it wasn't really Chinese, it was more Mongol dynasty. And also tried to conquer other satellite states such as Vietnam, Burma, Java, Japan, but it didn't quite work. Then there was the Golden Horde, and this was in Russia, and this was another one of the four dynasties of the original empire that broke up. And basically, all you need to know is that they maintain hegemony, which is the rule, in Russia until the mid-15th century, where Russia starts to rise with their own series of czars. Also, the Ilkhanate of Persia, so Kublai's brother, Hulagu, captured Baghdad, so that's in modern-day Iraq, in 1258, and that was a big deal as well. So in Persia, the Mongols really did something pretty smart. They basically put Persians in charge of their own empire. Basically, these Persians served the high positions, so ministers, governors, local officials, sort of like the Persians had done before with other people they conquered. And basically, the Mongols only cared about taxes and order. So as long as they had their money and there wasn't civil war, they were good. Also, the Ilkhan, for whom the Ilkhanate is named after, converted to Islam in 1295. So, of course, persecution of Christians and Jews followed because these three groups really didn't get along historically. In China, it was something different, though. The Mongols really, I guess, despised the Chinese, who were more powerful in the south originally, and so they outlawed intermarriage. So really frequently we see syncretism between cultures. This is not allowed here. Also, the Chinese couldn't learn the Mongol language, but they didn't really care because they had their own. Also, foreign administrators were brought into China, so like a Persian might be brought in, and this really pissed the Chinese off because, of course, their own people couldn't rule. Also, there were the dismissed Confucian scholars. So as we've seen before, the civil service examination really tried to serve up the bureaucrats of the government, but now this was not a thing. So even if you were smart, you couldn't, sort of give your family pride by going into government because the Mongols forbade it. Also, they were tolerant. If there's probably one good thing out of this, is that they became tolerant of all cultural and religious traditions in China. So as we frequently see in history, it was not the case here. There wasn't just one big religion. But the Mongols did favor the Lamaist Buddhism of Tibet, so that's also something good to know. So Mongols and Eurasian integration. One big thing that you need to take away from the Mongols is that they were all about trade. If there's one thing with the Mongols, it's definitely trade. So the Mongols worked to secure trade routes and ensure a safety of merchants. And they tried to establish this big courier network, so this is like mail and stuff, and they maintained a good order. Now this was crucial because up until this point, the last biggest empire was Alexander the Great, so that was from like Western Europe all the way to like India. Well, now this was like all of Eurasia except Western Europe. So the Mongols, up to this day, they maintain the biggest empire in all of world history. So that was a big deal. Of course they had to do this. There were also diplomatic missions. Of course, they needed to keep a good relationship with their states. And there were also resettlement. So like the Mongols, they needed some skilled people here and other educated people in other places. So they would sort of move them around to different positions within their territories, but ultimately it would always serve the Mongols. So the decline of the Mongols in Persia and China. So in Persia, of course, excessive spending and over-exploitation of the people. The people grew tired of the rulers, and the last ruler died without an heir. So of course, that didn't work out. Also, the Yuan dynasty, paper money was lost. Also, power struggles, assassinations, and eventually a civil war. But the biggest thing probably is this little thing, or big thing actually, is the bubonic plague. And basically, it started in southwest China in 1330s and spread throughout Asia and Europe, primarily through the Silk Roads, which, by the way, the Mongols helped start up again. And this was so bad because it caused so much depopulation and labor shortage, and it really just changed the world drastically, and it contributed to the overall fall of the Mongols. More on that later. But there were some khanates that survived. So Central Asia survived, of course, and the Golden Horde in Russia survived until the mid-16th century. So that was basically the Mongols. After the Mongols, there was basically not much more. It was just the Tamerlane, the whirlwind. So this was a lame conqueror. His name was Timur, so he's also referred to as Timur the Lame, and he was self-made, and he rose to power. And basically, he built this new Central Asian empire. And eventually, he conquered a lot of places as well, so like Persia, Afghanistan. He even attacked the Golden Horde in Russia. And he ruled the empire through tribal leaders, so he sort of unified them again. But his heirs struggled and once again divided the empire into 4 regions. The big thing out of this, though, is the foundation of the Ottoman Empire, which is this big Turkish empire that later would sort of operate out of Byzantine. They would conquer Byzantium in 1453, and this would sort of, Constantinople right here, and this would be sort of the turning point into modern world history. So that's definitely really important to know. So they sacked Constantinople in 1453 and renamed it Istanbul, which is still the name of the capital today. So they absorbed the remainder of the Byzantine Empire, and from then on, the mighty Ottoman Empire expanded, and we'll go from there. So this has been Chapter 18, Nomadic Empires and Eurasian Integration, basically talking about the Turkish peoples and Mongols. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one when we continue with the story of the world.